Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, welcome. Give a few minutes for folks to jump on board.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, welcome.
Turn that down. Okay. Good evening. How y'all doing? Everybody good? All right. Well, here we are. It is 7:02 by my counting. Got a few people coming on. We'll wait a few minutes for a couple more. While we do, go over a few things. Actually, y'all hold tight right there. My sound is really hot. I'm not sure how that's coming across on your end, but if it's hot on my end, it's probably hot on yours. So let me see if I can fix that. Hello, okay. Hopefully that is going to sound a bit better. Before, yeah, I think that's going to be quite a bit better. Let me know how that is sounding to you. If everything's good, everything look good. I mean, aside from the person, does the audio and video look good? Okay. Whew. Well, welcome again. Wednesday night, we're going through church history. Before we jump into that, just some announcements. I'm trying to keep an eye on the news to see what the guidelines and everything are for the lockdown, when we can return. So that should be coming hopefully in the next few weeks, I would assume. We are planning a meeting. It'll be small gathering in a great big room, so we won't violate any social distancing, but of church leadership to talk about how it is that we're going to open back up. What are the details? Are there things we need to be aware of? Are there things we need to be doing? Are there things that we need to be buying, providing? We'll look at all that. We'll talk about that. That will be this Saturday at 1 o'clock. So, I'm sorry. Everything was running smooth until about 5 minutes till, so I've been running around a bit, little winded. Let me grab a drink and then we'll roll on in to the lesson. Okay. Great awakening. Here we go. We are going to wake up, right? That's what we're doing. Okay, so we've been talking about church history, right? We've been going along, and a lot of what we've been doing has been focusing on the Catholic Church, because that's the big tradition that shaped so much of church history. And so as we've been going through, just a quick review of some of the things we have looked at recently to bring us to where we are. Well, like I said, we're talking a lot about the Catholic Church. And then as we were talking about the different struggles and the different ebbs and flows of different things going on in the Catholic Church, we then came along to the 1500s, where Martin Luther started causing some trouble in Germany, and we got the Reformation. And then, of course, he kicked off that, and other people started falling in line. So you get people like Calvin over in Geneva, starting his Reformation teachings. You got some other people in there, Zwingli in Switzerland, I believe. Oh goodness, what is the guy's name in Scotland? Was that John Knox? I think that was John Knox. You get England, because the king wanted to get a divorce, so they became Protestant. Kind of a weird reason to do it, but hey, whatever. And so you get all of that going on with the Reformation. However, at roughly the same time, you also start to have other developments going on. You get this guy in France named Galileo, who, this whole scientific revolution is starting to develop, where people are starting to study the world and see how things work. And he's looking out at the stars, and he's making claims and hypotheses and trying to figure stuff out there. You also have guys like Isaac Newton in England, who is making all kinds of waves in the scientific community, just pioneering, just brilliant guys coming up with all sorts of things, just discovering whole new things about the world. Eventually, you end up having René Descartes, philosopher from France, also kind of lived in the Netherlands, but he philosopher, he started thinking about what can we really know? What can we understand about the world? And he started doubting all kinds of things, right? Can I really know this? Can I really know that? And he was just, doubt was in overdrive. And he finally landed on that I can't doubt myself. If I'm thinking, then I must exist. And he built out this whole philosophy around doubt and certainty, that you can only know things that you're certain about. And then so you get that developing, and there's all kinds of things going on at this time. Eventually, Darwin's going to come on the scene with his theories of evolution and biological development. And then thrown in the mix of all of it, trying to figure out where Christianity should fit, you get this guy named Friedrich Schleiermacher, who is the father of modern liberal theology, where he starts thinking, we don't need all of that supernatural mysticism stuff, right? We just need to do the good deeds. We just need to love people. And that's important, and that's good. And so liberalism came up and said, hey, you know what? We can detach ourselves from all of that supernatural mysticism, miracles, and all of that, and we can just be good people like Jesus taught us to love. And so that's real basic, but that's what he came up with. And so you have all of this churning and going on, and that brings us up into the 1700s to the mid-1800s. And you think, now, wait a minute, Pastor. This is all going on in Europe. We're here in Texas. What does this have to do with us? Right? What's going on over here? Well, as you may know, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And of course, he hopped in his boat and he ran on over to trade in Asia. Well, that was the plan, but he hit a bit of an obstacle along the way. And he found the New World. He found North America. Actually, he found some islands, and then he discovered there was a big landmass behind him. And so here you got North America. And so while all of that is going on in Europe, you also have all this settling of what's called the New World. I mean, it's not new. It's been there all along. But here you have all of that going on. And so there is so much stuff that we could go into in the colonies and the settlements and everything. One of the hard parts about trying to teach an overview course on history is there's so much stuff you want to talk about. However, we're trying to keep it big, broad strokes. So we will mention that there was a lot of rich historical development that went on in the colonies and the settlements of North America, right? Everybody knows about the Puritans and the Mayflower, right? The Pilgrims coming over and landing there on Plymouth Rock. And so they're not the only ones, though. You have a lot of different groups that come to America specifically for the purpose of being able to seek out new opportunity and worship the way they want to. And so you get all of this developing to where you have this whole mix up and down the colonies, where different states kind of maybe have a focus of a particular religion. So you got the Puritans, the Congregationalists, up in Massachusetts, New England area, Quakers, particularly big in Pennsylvania. Anglicans are all over the place because, well, they're British colonies, so Church of England, of course. But you got Presbyterians and Lutherans and everything else kind of thrown in the mix all over the place. And so the New World, the colonies do have this kind of deep religious idea. However, as time goes by, as tends to happen when you get prosperous, they got a little complacent, I guess you could say. They kind of got to a point where their religion was just kind of part of the backdrop of their life. It wasn't about real deep devotion, right? Usually we tend to think about America as a Christian nation, and in a lot of ways, it was heavily influenced by Christian ideas. But just prior to the time of the revolution, it wasn't that everybody was just so hyper religious. Actually, it kind of become a little stagnant in their religion. And so that's when we come along to the Great Awakening, the first Great Awakening, right? We talk about how the founding fathers, how religious they were, and they were intensely religious. Many of them very, very religious people. You read their writings and they are thick with devout sayings reflecting their faith in Christ. And so what was the transition that took the colonies from maybe not entirely religious to zealously religious? Well, it was the first Great Awakening. So you have the colonies, and there are two figures in particular that we need to understand if we want to know what's going on with this Great Awakening, and how it is that the fires, the embers of belief are restoked in the colonies. Two guys, you're going to have Jonathan Edwards, a pastor from New England, and then you're going to have George Whitefield, a missionary and preacher from England. And so we're going to take a real quick look at these two guys to understand what's going on. And again, trying to pick and choose what to say and what to look at. There's just so much rich history and theology and things that we could look at with the Great Awakening, but we're specifically wanting to do the broad brush look at what got us where we are today. And to understand religion, Baptists, evangelicals, right, in America in 2020, we need to understand the path we took to get here. So we're just going to tread that path quickly. So let's take a look at Jonathan Edwards. As I said, Edwards was a pastor in Massachusetts. He come from the Congregationalist Puritan tradition. And the interesting thing is he drew these huge crowds. Some reports say that upwards of 30 people a week were getting saved, right? We're making confessions to Christ. We're being baptized. And so there's just this huge revival breaking out. And there hadn't really been revivals, right? What we think of as revivals hadn't really been a thing up to this point. There had maybe been some sparks here or there, but this was something new. I mean, it's just these massive crowds would come to hear him preach. And he would focus on not so much the kind of almost Pharisaic legalism of Puritans, of, be good, do the good works. He focused rather on God's sovereignty and grace. Whether you rely on that God is in control and rest on his grace. And so less so on the works, more so on the grace, not that he's dismissing the works, but he preached grace. And another thing that he really stressed is that God is the God of all. Right, that it's not just some miraculous works, some kind of crazy special things that happen every now and then, but God, kind of the same idea that helped undergird why science developed, that God is behind the universe. The scripture says he's sustaining it, right? And so you have a God who is in everything, right? When you see the sunrise, that's God's beautiful hand at work in creating that for you. When you see the majesty of the mountains, you look and you see, well, God did that. Whenever you see the ebbs and flows of the ecological system and life and how it all works, you go, wow, look, God designed that. God created that. And so you see the beauty, the majesty, the glory of God all around you, not only in the supernatural and miraculous. He is most known for his sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. which is really interesting because when you think of Edwards, you don't think of the fiery, hellfire, brimstone kind of preacher. I mean, he had the theology, but that wasn't really his thing. He was more of a reserved theologian, scholarly type guy. He was not a very dynamic preacher. One commentator actually said of him that he scarcely gestured or even moved. And he made no attempt by the elegance of his style or the beauty of his pictures to gratify the taste and fascinate the imagination. Right? I mean, I'm not the most, charismatic preacher, but even how I am, that wouldn't be Edwards. I've actually heard before that he was one of those that would write out his sermon and just read it. He'd get up in the pulpit and just read, blah, 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 blah. Very, very bland, very boring. What's interesting, a quick little story. Years ago, I went to a pastor's conference. And as normally happens at pastors' conferences, is they bring out the guys who are the pastors of the mega churches or who have headed big organizations, who are the successful preachers and pastors to show you how it's done. And these guys, man, they just had a commanding presence and they were dynamic and they were hip and it was just all exciting. And watching the crowd, granted, we're a whole bunch of Baptists, but watching the crowd, it was just like, okay, that's nice. People taking notes. And then this old guy got up there. He had to have been 80-something years old, if he was a day over 20. And so he gets up there and he just walks up to the podium, gets out his notes, and starts talking. He's not dynamic. He's not going crazy. He's just even keel, almost monotone. But you would think you were in a Pentecostal service. Amen, brother. Yeah, preach it. Yeah, just hearing this going on. Whereas all the guys who you would think were so exciting and would stir the crowd didn't. But that really shows the Spirit of God moving in the preacher's life whenever they get up there, and they don't have to be flashy and showy, right? It said that instead of all this flashiness and showmanship, that Edwards persuaded with an overwhelming weight of argument and with such intenseness of feeling. I can just imagine there's just a weight of intensity that's on the audience, that's on the people hearing, right? So he's not dynamic, but man, the message he's bringing just weighs on you. And so people came to hear. And so you have that kind of breaking out in New England. And there's a ton more that can be said about Jonathan Edwards and the contributions that he made to the way people thought about religion and theology. But he sprang out this revival of people coming to understand their sinners and seeking the grace of God. And so that broke out in New England. Then we have, there we go, George Whitefield. George was not initially an American. I don't know if he ever became, well, back then they were all British. He was from England, which isn't a big deal because back then they were all British. So it didn't really matter where he came from. So he began early on in London. He was actually partnered with John and Charles Wesley, the founders of the Methodist Church. And they actually had a bit of a falling out. Nothing bad. They actually remained friends. John Wesley spoke at Whitefield's funeral. But they had a split because Whitefield was a Calvinist and Wesley's were Arminian. And so he let them have the denomination and, or he let them have the church, the organization, didn't try to fight him over, and he went and did his own thing. And so he helped begin what becomes the Methodist Church. But then he comes to America, and he actually comes to America with a group that is moving. He's helping them get settled and plant churches and kind of how to function following Christ in this new world. And while he's there, down in Georgia, he actually starts founding some orphanages, some of which are actually still in operation today. He had a huge, huge heart for the orphans. And so, and then he began preaching. And the funny thing is, he had this voice that could just really just boom and just get out there. And not that he could speak in a big room, he could speak in a field or a public square where thousands are gathered, and he could still project and be heard even out in the open. He just had this natural talent, gifting of his voice, being able to reach and be heard. And he would draw massive crowds, and partly, I think, because of his message, but also because he was an exciting, dynamic preacher. He really kind of got people going, which... if I can just be a little odd for a moment. I shouldn't be backing up. Oh, well, I'm going to do it. Okay. Uh-oh, too far. Too many clicks. All right. So that's Edwards. I could almost see Edwards being dynamic, but he was the boring guy. This was the exciting guy, right? Your grandpa with a wig. He was the dynamic, exciting guy. Okay. That just kind of shows our thinking and the way things are nowadays, that that's not the way we think about things, right? We look and go, oh, boring, right? Okay, but here he is, this dynamic preacher. It was actually said because at one point, Whitefield met Edwards. He actually went up to New England. He got to preach in Edwards' church a time. And so, he went around and he, got to know some of those preachers and people up there, and he did some preaching up in New England. But Edwards' wife actually said this about Whitefield. She said, he makes less of the doctrines than our American preachers do and aims more at affecting the heart. Right? So whereas Edwards and others, they're hammering the doctrine, right? They're hammering we're sinners, we need grace and justification and election. They're just hammering the theology and the doctrine. Whitefield is going after the heart, right? He's going after the conscience. She says he is a born orator. A prejudiced person I know might say that this is all theatrical artifice and display, but not so will anyone think who has seen and known him. So yeah, he's flashy and he's, all about the experience and the emotion, and he's trying to go straight for your heart, right? But it's not all a show, right? He's drawing these big crowds because how exciting a preacher he is, but it's not a show. She's saying he's the real deal. He loves the Lord. So he starts going on these preaching tours, right? Not just America, right? He's preaching over in England and up in Scotland, but he does spend a lot of time in America. The thing is, these preaching tours that he's going on, right? He's non-denominational. Right? He's not just kind of going and hitting the churches that he belongs to. Right? If I were to get out and start speaking, I would most likely be more welcome and find more opportunity in Baptist churches. Right? I'm a Baptist, so maybe I go speaking at Baptist churches. And, I'm a Southern Baptist, probably not going to be having, too many other denominations going, yeah, let's let this, fundamentalist Baptist preacher come preach, right? You tend to stay in your lane. Now, Whitefield, he was just going and he was preaching. And because it was public, anyone would come, and it didn't matter because he was not preaching a denomination-specific message. He was just preaching salvation. He was just giving the basic gospel. You're a sinner. You need grace. Come to Jesus. And the message was a come as you are. Oh, you poor sinner, come to the cross. That just a simple message that is at home in any just about denomination. So there you have Edwards and Whitefield, who spark this new movement of people coming back to Christ that is spurring on this devotion to religion. And now remember, it's not that people were not believers. They were just kind of stale believers. Right? And so what Edwards and Whitefield were doing, not so much that they were going out there and making converts, but that they were telling people and awakening people that they need to actually live what they say they believe. They go sit in that church every Sunday and they hear those words and they hear what that Bible says, but is it really affecting their lives? And so they start to devote themselves. And so you get this growth of devotion and zeal for the Lord. Okay, Well, that's great. That's fun. But what are the impacts of this? Why does this really matter? Well, one slightly controversial, not all historians would agree, this seems to be kind of laying the foundation for the roots of what would become the fundamentalist movement. It could be argued that if it was not for Edwards and Whitefield, what would later become fundamentalism could not have been born in America. That's debated. I tend to agree that that is the case, but that's neither, I think, that important of a deal. It also sets the context for the American Revolution, right? And so what's going on at this time is that people, they're coming to these revivals, they're hearing Whitefield preach, and rather than, you almost, it's like a mini Reformation, rather than their allegiance being to their denomination and the leaders of their church, now they're just looking straight to Jesus. And so you almost kind of get not a distrust, but at least some sense of disconnect from institutional authority. Right. Whereas before you were a member of a church, and that is who you were and where you were and how you were defined, and you didn't go to another church. If you went to it was just really divisive, kind of tribal. But now that's starting to break up because people are just getting this kind of pure gospel message, direct line to Jesus, and so you're starting to get this disconnect from institutional authority. At the very least, you could say this kind of softens the pill that America is going to have to swallow with the revolution. And then this also kind of gives you the beginning of this kind of emotional revivalism. Whitefield came along, and his preaching, like I said, he wasn't preaching bad doctrine, but he was preaching to the heart. Right? He wasn't getting up there and giving an intellectual argument and treatise and inviting you to agree with him. He was going after your emotions. And so this kind of is the beginning of what we tend to be used to of revivals, where it's firing, it's passionate, and people are getting worked up, right? That's the beginning of this. And so that is the first Great Awakening. And I say first because there is a second. In between the two, you have the Revolution. But the first Great Awakening really kind of, I want to say, centered around, Edwards and Whitefield, but they were the main players. They were the ones that really got it going and really kind of set the tone and what the Great Awakening was. Okay. The second Great Awakening comes a little bit later, and it's about 1780 to 1820, and you just really get some new movements going on. And one of the things that spurs this on is you get westward expansion, right? Kind of the end of the 1700s into the beginning of the 1800s, right? The colonies, now their own new nation, right? Because remember, before, they had, from England, they had charters, right? They'd come and they'd form a colony, and they had a charter from the king that said, here are your boundaries. And so they actually had westward boundaries. But now, free from the king, free from the charter, they have all this land on the other side of these mountains. And so America starts to spread, the United States starts to spread to the west. Now, as they're spreading, right, you kind of are having this, what we would call rugged individualism, right? It's that American spirit. We're free. We can do it ourselves, right? We don't need you, right? They just threw off a king. There's this whole idea of freedom and self-determination, and I can do it, right? A real pioneer spirit. And so they're driving westward, and they have this kind of very individualistic mindset. And so you start to see a rise in new denominational groups that don't have quite so much the hierarchical institution, kind of top-down authority. And specifically, the two biggest ones are going to be the Baptists and the Methodists, particularly the Methodists. You actually get in 1770, there's this explosion. In 1770, before the Revolution, there are only 20 Methodist churches in the United States, in the colonies. However, fast forward 90 years later, not even a century later, and you have 19,000 Methodist churches in the United States. In that 90 years, they become the largest denomination in America, and I believe the Baptists were not too far behind. Because both of these don't have quite so much of the kind of hierarchical, authoritative, institutional view, that they actually have a little more of the individualistic mindset. And so people with that American spirit took to them quite easily. Well, now you start having these revival movements, right? As people are going out west, one of the things that happens is, it's pioneers, it's settlers. There's not a lot of intellectuals and elites and scholarly types that are going out there. And so what ends up happening is they need clergy, they need ministers, and it's the Methodists and the Baptists who answer that call. And so you actually get, the Methodists were great at this. They think pioneered the idea. You get the circuit riders, where you would have preachers who would make the circuits, and they'd go around preaching town to town, go around preaching. Towns didn't have churches. So, here comes the traveling pastor. He would come in and do the pastor duties and preach some sermons, move on to the next town. And so you're getting this developing, and then you also start to get these revival movements. The most notable ones were in, I believe it was called Logan County, Kentucky. They had these camp meetings where probably what is the predecessors of what we're all used to, right? You go to youth summer camp, and they actually had these where, you'd have all the tents, and they'd have the platform and the preaching, and people would come camp for days. And you would actually have between like 10,000 and 22,000 people in attendance at these camps, where it's revival meetings. And the big thing about them is, it's not just that it's revival meetings, but it's not tied to church. And that's kind of dangerous, but it's also, right. It's this growth of this individualism that we see going on in America, right? If we want to go to camp here locally, we have some choices and stuff, but there's a camp called Latham Springs, and it is a Baptist camp, right? It is kind of supported by some local Baptist associations. I used to take my youth group up to Lone Star, Texas, to Lakeview Baptist Encampment, where the Baptist, association there kind of was over that camp, because it was, where you have the denomination sponsoring camps. These are non-denominational. They're not being controlled by any church organization. They're just, laity standing up and teaching and preaching. The Spirit's moving, people coming to the Lord, and you just got these massive movements going on. And what develops, and I'm not real sure exactly what made kind of this develop, but what ended up developing is what you could call a dystopian pessimism, right? This dark future is looming, evil is afoot, the world is gone wrong, and we must fix it, right? You get this idea where, barbarians are at the gate, Satan's on the move, we have to go, church, let's go get them, right? This whole kind of, we have to grow, we have to preach, we have to get the church, we have to regain our influence, we have to take a position of authority in society to fix what is wrong. And so you get a lot of this kind of preaching and this kind of attitude going on at this time. However, you also have a lot of appeal to holy living, right? It's not all just hellfire, brimstone, come to Jesus. It's also, follow Jesus. You actually get a lot of, remember, the Methodists are a big push in this movement. And Methodism, taking their cues from their founders, John and Charles Wesley, was real big on what some people today might call social justice, but it's the idea of looking for the wrongs in your community and the wrongs in society and trying to do something, help the people around you, right? That you take this idea of love others as yourself and you take it seriously and you go for it. And so you have that spirit kind of tied in with all of this holy living, that you need to follow Jesus. You need to love your neighbor. You need to be a good person, right? And so not, like puritanical legalism, but more of a living out of holiness. Okay. As you could imagine, there are going to be some abuses in this, right? There's all sorts of ways this could go wrong. Like I said, a lot of these revival movements and things springing up didn't have a lot of church oversight. They weren't, church-sponsored necessarily movements. You didn't have some kind of church hierarchy kind of making sure they weren't going off the rails. And so there were lots of opportunity for people to teach and preach horrible things. And sometimes people did. You would get people like kind of an overdose of revival, right? There was one place, I think it was in New Jersey, that's actually called the Burned Over District. It was kind of like a crossroads of some of these different revival circuits. And there were so many church meetings, so many revivals, so many preachers came through there that eventually people just got sick of it. They got burned out on revivals. And you didn't have churches to ground people. So what happened is you'd have this preacher come through, preach a revival. Woo, everybody gets stirred up. We all love Jesus. And now what? Because we don't have a church. Now what do we do? Right? Or you have these big camp meetings where thousands of people are coming to the Lord. But then what do? They go home and what? Was there a follow-up? Was there a local church they're plugging into? What do? And so you kind of get a lot of that going on. One of the things, and I was going to get into it, but there is so much, the manipulation and emotional hype that went on the revivals of the Second Great Awakening. Probably the number one name people would mention on this would be Charles Finney. And he actually developed his revivals in such a way that they were crafted to manipulate. And where you'd have the center seat, where it's like, if there's someone that really needs preached to, right, you sit them there, right up front where they're getting hammered, right, where you have what's called the anxious bench, where if you're really wrestling with something, and you think you're on the verge of, meeting Jesus, you come and you sit in that bench and everybody's just praying for you, right? And it was just a lot of just really intense and emotional manipulation and hype that would go on. Not the Holy Spirit can't move even in those situations, but it does give a breeding ground for abuse. You have apocalyptic movements that start to develop, right? These ideas that the end is near, right? Here comes the end. We're in the end times. You see how evil this world is, right? Does this sound familiar? This started back then, right? Here it comes. There's the Antichrist, right? You need to come to Jesus because the end is near, right? You get a lot of this kind of preaching. You get some people who start to predict when the end will be. And they, so it's like, it's going to be in 1843. We better all follow Jesus. And you start to get all of these kind of movements. You also get some that are a little more vague, but they focus on the expectation of the return, like Adventists, right? Seventh-day Adventists and things where you get these movements that they don't go off the rails crazy, but they focus on the return of Christ as their kind of central focus. So what was the impact of the Second Great Awakening? Because this one, the first one was pretty big in the colonies, but this one's sweeping all around the nation. One of the things that comes about, and we don't want to miss this, one of the things that comes out of the Second Great Awakening is the abolition movement. Because one of the biggest movers of the Second Great Awakening is the Methodist Church, and Methodism from the beginning has been anti-slavery. John Wesley was a really nice guy, and he didn't usually say mean things much, but he had some very not nice things to say about slavery. And so the Methodist Church, sadly not Baptist, especially Southern Baptists, we actually started our denomination to fight for slavery. Bad on you guys. Glad we fixed that one. But the Methodists, they were anti-slavery from the beginning. And so this Second Great Awakening that was largely fueled a big chunk in part by Methodism, carried a lot of abolitionist, anti-slavery sentiments. And so that this is the roots kind of building up of what is going to become abolition and the end of slavery, traced back to the Second Great Awakening. Like I said before, there was this appeal to holy living, right? That not just quit being a sinner, it's a sin, right? But let them, we really need to follow Jesus, right? We really need to love our neighbors. Right? Well, whenever it says bear one another's burdens, it really means that, right? Whenever it says don't lie, we need to not lie, right? And so a lot of this building of holy living, right, that you improve your life and the lives of those around you. And this is also where we get Sunday school, right? Sunday school was originally started as school, right? It was churches who were seeing, people are illiterate and uneducated. And so you would come to church and you don't just get the preacher, but you get Sunday school, where you actually come to school and you learn to read and write and math. And that's where Sunday school started. It was actual school. And that developed during this time as well. And so what we find here at the end of the Second Great Awakening is that we're getting the stage set for the beginning of the 20th century and what's going to happen through the 1900s, right? Because here now you have this now on fire, zealous reawakening of Orthodox historic Christianity following after Jesus. But then coming up against it, coming over from Europe, you have Schleiermacher's liberalism, you have the German biblical school of higher textual criticism, You have Darwin coming up with evolution in the middle of the 1800s. And so you have all of this is stirring around and is going to come together in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But that will be next week. Okay. Well, I'm done. That was quite a bit. It could have been so much more. Really fun topic. So if there are any questions, now would be a wonderful time. If you are watching live, you can put it there in the live chat on YouTube, or church members, you got my number. You can just text it to me directly. And let me see, because remember last time I had a problem where I couldn't see any questions. There was someone giving them, but I wasn't seeing them. Okay. And I'm not seeing any now. All right. Well, reminder, Saturday at 1:00. And I don't expect many people, and we got a great big old room so we can social distance. But Saturday at 1:00, meeting for the church, strategy for reopening. What are the things we need to consider? Right? We're not just going to throw the doors open and pile everybody in. How are we going to do this? This Sunday, I cannot stress enough, question and answer. Our quarterly question and answer event is coming up this Sunday, April 26th at 6 p.m., and it will be live right here on this YouTube channel. You're going to have me and Dave Dover here answering your questions. Patrick is going to be beaming in from Georgetown. Newcomer friend, he's actually been here and preached right here in this pulpit, Tyler Vella. He's from California. He's going to be beaming in. You'll have the four of us answering your questions live right here on this live stream. Submit your questions early, right? Text me, email me, get on the website, send a message, Facebook it, whatever, however you need to get me. If you want to get your questions in early to kind of make sure that they're in the queue and that they get answered, we want to make sure that this functions as smoothly and as nicely as we can make it. And so really, really excited about this. I'd love for it to just explode and be a fun thing. That is Sunday, the 26th, this Sunday, 6 p.m. right here, live. Okay. Well, then it looks like we are done. I'm done. Have a wonderful evening.